your highlight? First of all, the history of here. On
the Cape Coast, getting to the dungeon. Get the dungeon.
This structure dates back to the 17th century. It was built in 1665 by the English. But when we talk about who constructed this building, we can say Africans constructed this building. The labor they used were Africans, though they brought in some few masons, carpenters, engineers, and artisans from Europe. This is the third structure the Europeans constructed along the coast of Ghana. The first one was Elmina Castle. Elmina Castle was built around 1482 by Portugal. That one is about 200 years older than ᴶᵒʰώς Castle. And we have the other one in Accra by name Christiansborg Castle. Overall, it is estimated that West Africa had about 60 European forts and castles. And out of that number, Ghana had more than 50. Ghana had about 90% of all the forts and castles West Africa had. So you will wonder why Ghana had that much. We had that much because of gold. Gold attracted the Europeans to this part of the world. So what I want to say here is the Europeans did not come here to spread the gospel. They didn't come here to give us their Western form of education. Later, that was second. The primary one was gold, because they realized, they knew so well that the gold they bought from the North Africans had its source south of the Sahara. They also got to know we had a lot of gold here through Mansa Musa, the richest man ever to live on this earth. So Mansa Musa was the emperor of the Ghana Empire. So when we talk about the Ghana Empire, we are talking about present-day Mali, Mauritania, Niger. This empire was big and vast, and Mansa Musa had a lot of gold. And interestingly, this part of the world made Mansa Musa rich, because gold and salt was coming from this place through his empire to North Africa. So he made very good use of the gold and salt that went through his empire. Mansa Musa established Timbuktu as a center of learning, where he established one of the first and finest universities in the world. Again, he had one of the finest and best libraries in the world. But actually, the world got to know of Mansa Musa when he traveled from Mali to Mecca. Wherever he passed, he devalued the price of gold. So this is to say, this man took a lot of caravans of gold along. So this news about his wealth in gold spread all over the Middle East and Europe. So yes, the Europeans got to know that we had a lot of gold. That was a waiting place for the male captives before they were transported away from here. And again, right above the male dungeons was the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. So this is to say, the church played a big role in the transatlantic slave trade. The mother of all churches, the Roman Catholic Church, suggested that Africans should be used as slaves in place of the native Indians. And again, the church used their Bible to justify the transatlantic slave trade, to say that their God had told them that Africans were bound to be the white man's slave. They used the story of Noah and Ham to justify this, but these were all fraudulent and malicious. This was their greed. They needed an excuse, or they needed that propaganda to spread. Because basically in Europe then, it was about the church and the state. So people believed what the church said, made whatever money they made, the church equally made that money. So that is how come we see the evidence here. A place of suffering, and a holy place where they worship their God. It is not a coincidence that we have this here. Visit Elmina Dungeons The same happened. The Dutch constructed their Protestant church on top of a female dungeon. The same Portuguese. So underneath a Portuguese church, underneath a Roman Catholic church, was the slave market. The same happened at ᴶᵒṕ. So all along the coast of Ghana, the Europeans constructed their churches on dungeons to depict what their God had told them to do. 1471, the Portuguese arrived about 10 kilometers from here. They had what they searched for. Henceforth, they called that area La Mina, or Elmina, the gold mine. Some few years later, they constructed Elmina Castle for the gold business. So that was the reason why Ghana's coast was flooded with European fortress castles. And with time, we had this issue with the Europeans fighting among themselves to have trading posts. So when you look at the history of this land changed hands about 5 times among the Europeans. Once this place was occupied by Portugal, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, England. Before one could take over from the other, they went through a bloody war. So the British were the last occupants. They occupied this space 1664 after they defeated the Dutch and lived here from 1664 to 1957. So if you should note, they left here about 65 years ago. Today, my emphasis will be on something else. I'm going to tell you a lot more about the transatlantic slave trade. It happened that in Europe, the demand for gold dropped or shifted to the demand for coffee, sugar, cotton, tobacco. Those crops could not grow in Europe. We have the era where the Europeans explored the New World, forced themselves to have colonies. They established plantation farms. These plantation farms to them demanded human labor. And unfortunately, this part of the world was shusted, all because they were like Africans were resilient, stronger, robust. The African could resist the weather in South America, the Caribbean, because if you look at the Caribbeans, the West Indies and South America, we are on the same tropic. They are on the same tropic with West Africa. So the weather here is much, much similar to the weather there. So unfortunately, we became victims for the transatlantic slave trade. Talking about the structure, from day one, the British built it for the transatlantic slave trade, not the gold trade. So that is the difference between Elmina Castle and ᴶᵒṕ Castle. Around the 15th century, the Portuguese constructed that structure for gold. The 17th century, the British constructed this for the transatlantic slave trade. So from here, the British moved Africans to New York, to Washington, to Maryland, North and South Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Jamaica, Barbados, Bermuda, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, British Guyana in South America. Some few ended up in England. So those were the destinations from this building. This structure was the headquarters for the British trading activities in slaves and in gold in the whole of Africa. So this is one role the structure played. So I'll show you the condemned cell. The condemned cell was a death chamber. People were executed in them. And the form of execution was through suffocation, thirst, and hunger. So I say this is part of the physical torture the Europeans administered to us. They were trying to put some fear in us. They were trying to deter us. We have 5 rooms or 5 chambers within the male dungeon. Every chamber, they squeezed in about 200 men. So about 200 men were squeezed in, same in the other rooms. They spent about 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months in these dungeons before the ships arrived. Whatever number of days they spent in here, they had to go to the toilet, they had to urinate, they had to sleep, they had to eat, they had to do everything here. I will lead you through the first room, but please be careful. squeezed in about 200 people in this room. And the holes you see up there was the only way 200 men had light and air. And that was the only way they could determine day and night. So the thing is, if you should squeeze 200 people in here, the temperature in this room would definitely change. This place is going to be hot. At the end of the day, we spent a maximum days of about 3 months. You had to go to toilet. So, like for example, wherever you find yourself, you had to go to toilet, you had to urinate, you had to sleep, you had to eat, you had to drink water, you had to do everything in the dungeons. So by the time the ships arrived, many had died. It is estimated that out of every 4, 1 died before the ships arrived. Diseases like diarrhea and vomiting killed many. They never had access to medicine when they were sick. I want to show you something on the floor, carefully. Those gutters were provided for toilets and urine to go through into the sea. But you can ask this question, how many times can toilets and urine run through these gutters? If about 200 men were here, and if this dungeon was used for more than 100 years, so for more than 100 years, this place was filled up, emptied, filled up. The British never cleaned this place up. So with time, toilet, urine, mud, vomit, everything they left got mixed up and covered the floor, the entire floor to about this height. To about this height, this whole place was filled up. 1973, we excavated this room. And after the excavation, we found the original floor and the gutters. But we left you this portion to see. Thank you. So this portion here actually, this contains everything they left.
Yes.
So this contains some DNA.
Yes.
Contains toilet, urine, vomit, blood, sweat, tears, saliva, everything they left. We have it here. And we've had nothing like excavation for the rest of the rooms. So immediately we step out, remember that we are walking on top of everything they left. The thing is, we can't go about removing things. We do that, we are distorting history. We are changing the narrative, so we left the other ones there for us to see. They were stolen from different ethnic groups within West Africa. Because as far as from Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, they brought people here to be shipped out. So understand this, the coast of West Africa and Central Africa was a transit point during the transatlantic slave trade. But it is estimated that Ghana exported or Ghana transported over 40%. So we can actually say that Ghana was one of the main transit points during the transatlantic slave trade. So the people transported were not necessarily Ghanaians. Some were brought from the neighboring West African countries. And those who did not survive the conditions in these dungeons, when they died, let's say if about 5 or 10 people died today, the bodies were piled up. They added a load. The load could be a rock or a metal. Then the bodies were thrown into the sea. So we got to know that the Atlantic Ocean was infested with sharks. Sharks from different oceans will swim all the way to this ocean because they had it in their minds that they were going to drop bodies either from the ships or from the dungeons. And again, we learned that till date, it is still embedded in the brains of sharks to follow ships from West Africa to the Caribbean, to the West Indies and to North America. So you can think of the million African bodies, of a million bodies they dropped in the ocean. Because for it to be embedded in the brains of the sharks, then that means that cycle continued for a longer period, more than 400 years. It also meant that millions of African bodies were thrown into the sea. Any questions or comments, brothers and sisters, before we move on? Good. Through the other row. So everything you see on the floor is actually their DNA. And you here also represent our ancestors. You represent those who were taken away from feces, urine, blood, vomit, saliva, tiers and all that. Like right above this place was a Church of England. And underneath the Church of England is the male dungeons. Up there, they constructed an observation post where some of their soldiers would stand and watch. And interestingly, the entrance of that observation post is closer to the entrance of the church. So whoever passed by to worship their God could smell, could see, and hear whatever was going on in the dungeons. Those in the dungeons also heard what was going on upstairs. I will lead you to the last one. The British intentionally created this room for it to be bright. So the thing is, when the ships arrived, they didn't just move all of them into the ship. They sorted them out. They picked those who were strong and fit enough to survive the journey. Those who were sick and incapable of surviving the journey stayed behind in the dungeons till the last of them died. On records, we learned that those ones were near death. Within a day or two, they would die. They would not put them on the ships, but rather they would leave them in the dungeons to die. And after they died, their bodies were thrown into the sea. So those who were fit or strong enough to survive the middle passage were well chained, shackled, and roped. Gradually, the dungeon was emptied. From here, the male captives were taken through a tunnel to the door of no return. Right behind the wall, right behind it, the British built a tunnel or a passage. So in chains and in shackles, all the men were taken through the tunnel to the door of no return. But unfortunately, the tunnel is closed now. Around 1807, the English passed a law in their parliament abolishing or ending the transportation of Africans from here as slaves in America, Jamaica, Barbados, and all that. When they passed that law, it did not end slavery.
Right.
Slavery continued, still within the British territories, till 1834. Slavery continued in the United States till 1865, after the Civil War. Slavery continued still in Brazil till 1888. So overall, the transatlantic slavery continued for more than 400 years. It started in the 15th century and ended in the late 19th century. So though we cannot go through the tunnel, or we go up again, I'm going to show you some part of the tunnel. I spoke to you about the tunnel, where all the men were taken through to join the women at the door of no return. We are right on top of it. So when we go down that way again, I'm going to show you some part of the tunnel and the exit. You find there are balls, the cannonballs and the guns. So yes, it happened that these guys were fighting among themselves. So the guns were actually used against their fellow Europeans, the Dutch. So the thing is, the British did everything in their blood to make sure that their investment will not end up in the hands of the French or the Dutch. I'm speaking English to you today because my oppressor needs me. And interestingly, English is not my official language. English is now my official language. I speak Fante, make a Fante. But because I was colonized, I'm now speaking English. So if Ghana was also colonized by France, like by now, I'll be speaking French to you. So over time, these guys were fighting among themselves and realized that the wars among them did them no good. So they were like, oh, brothers, let us come together and peacefully we can share this cake among us. So around the 19th century, the Europeans met in Germany, Berlin. They brought forward Africa like a piece of cake and they shared it among themselves. So the boundaries we know today are all artificial. And one thing you should also realize is when the Europeans were making their demarcations, when they were sharing Africa among themselves, they didn't put into consideration the ethnicity, the tribes, and our culture. They just went ahead and carved Africa. So that also brought us a lot of issues. We now had boundaries in Africa. Before their coming, there was nothing like that.
You guys agree with me that that's not much progress over 54 years? 1968 was the year that Dr. Martin Luther King was killed on April 4th in Memphis. And he had the same blueprint plan that I've kind of adopted to move forward. It's my belief that since our ancestors have been abducted to this or to foreign land, whether it's the islands or anywhere else, We've been suffering from layers upon layers upon layers of intergenerational, untreated, unresolved financial trauma that has negatively impeded our ability to build wealth. Anybody agree with that? If you don't, I'll tell you how. 1619 to 1865, we were wealth. 1865, General William T. Sherman. Anybody heard of him? He led the Civil War, and upon the completion of the war, he went and spoke with a lot of the religious leaders and says, we're trying to assimilate African Americans from slavery into society. How can we do that? What should we do? The minister said, how about giving us land? So they agreed in field order number 15 to give us 40 acres of tillable soil, affectionately known as 40 acres and a mule. Lincoln signed it. Lincoln was shortly assassinated. Andrew Jackson becomes president and reverses the order and gives all the land to the South to the Confederates. That's what happened. Financial trauma. 1865 to 1874. After the soldiers fought the Civil War, they needed a place to put their money. They decided to create a bank called Freedmen Savings and Trust. Congress created this. It was a good idea, a combination of the government as well as a combination of some philanthropists decided to put this bank together. They put together a board of trustees to manage the bank. We started putting our money in there, building up a little savings with the little pennies that we were making, and all of a sudden, this committee, who was a committee of other banks, took all their bad loans and moved those bad loans to our bank. Eventually, the bank was in such hardship that they asked Frederick Douglass to come take over the bank and to turn it around. Frederick Douglass looked at the bank and said, hey, there's nothing here. Congress then closed the bank. African Americans lost all of their savings. More financial trauma. Reconstruction, 1861 to 1877. That's the era when we were really trying to assimilate African Americans to normal society, the sharecropping era. My dad, in fact, is the son of a sharecropper. He was raised on a farm in North Carolina, and they picked tobacco back in the day. This was the era where the white man owned the land. The black families actually worked the land as farmers. But they only made enough money to feed their family and never enough money to build any wealth. Financial trauma. 1921, we all know what happened there, right? The Tulsa Race Massacre, right? We started building wealth at this time. Our businesses, our homes were raided based on a lie. 1930, redlining. You guys heard about that? Where the government took a map and he basically laid out certain areas and they redlined it, where they were sending signals to mortgage companies and insurance companies not to provide insurance or mortgages in that area, thereby ghettoizing our neighborhoods and putting us into those neighborhoods. 1900 to 1964, 1965, the Jim Crow era, where it was legal to discriminate against black people in terms of financial institutions, educational institutions, employment, and healthcare. It was legal, no problem. It was legal until Dr. Martin Luther King, through his efforts, led the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the voting rights of 1965. It was also illegal for us to vote until 1965. There's more. 2007 to 2008, the Great Recession and the housing crisis, where African Americans were forced into subprime loans, who actually qualified for conforming loans, who had good credit scores and great income. But there were some institutions, I don't want to bring them out by names, Wells Fargo, that actually, and they were sued by the NAACP for about $1 billion, that coded certain loans, mud loans, or ghetto loans. So there was this, you can Google this. So there was discussion about how they were discussing loans and forcing us into subprime loans where they were making big bucks on it. And we were forced into loans that had short maturities and high balloons at the end. As a result, when the housing crisis soon collapsed because of deregulation under the Bush era, the banks were forced to basically call your loan. So either you had to find the money or refinance it, but you couldn't refinance it at the time because companies like Countrywide were going out of business, right? And then they give it to President Barack Obama, who turned this completely around during that housing crisis. 2020, COVID-19, where many African American businesses could not get PPP loans. Small businesses that deserved them. Meanwhile, millionaires and billionaires got loans, right? A good number of African American businesses went out of business, our restaurants, our stores, whatever we had. More financial trauma. 2020, 2022, the cryptocurrency bubble. I get a lot of hagglers fighting me over cryptocurrency. I never invest in cryptocurrency. It's too speculative. It's not, there's no value tied to it. I can go on and on and on about it. The interesting thing about it is, if you look at how it impacted African Americans, a good portion of African Americans who got into cryptocurrency very late lost all their money, right? And the interesting thing about it, the majority of them had never even bought one share of stock. 2022, the home appraisal bias. Have you guys heard of that? Where a professor in Maryland bought a house, wanted to refinance it, to take some cash out. They valued the house at about $450,000. He knew that it was not right. He went to one of his co-workers who was white, had him go to the house, had the house appraised, and they appraised it for over $700,000. Right? It's real. Present day, we still suffer from discrimination in education, in housing, in banking, in healthcare, the whole 9 yards. More and more financial trauma. Do you agree that we have layers upon layers of financial trauma? Mm-hmm. Studies of the impact of childhood trauma reveals that throughout a child's life, they continue to struggle with self-worth, feeling good enough, forming authentic connections and relationships, whether business or personal, cognitive abilities, mindset, and chronic health problems. Do those sound like 4 significant things that our community continue to struggle with? Come on, I can't hear y'all. Those 4, right? Our untreated, unresolved trauma intensifies due to the infiltration in our culture based on our music, our place of worship, TV programming, advertising, social media, and nearly every aspect of our lives. It just gets piled on, piled on, and piled on. More and more trauma. I was on social media with James the other day, and I was reading some of the comments, and somebody said, that's just an excuse. No other community has ever had to deal with such trauma. To the extent and to the degree that we've had to, no one has. So there's no evidence that this trauma can be easily inverted and did not have an impact on our lives. And the media believes that we should be able to close the racial wealth gap after dealing with all this trauma. What's your problem, right? The interesting thing about it is, the way I look at it, I don't think that our wealth should be measured in comparison to whites. I mean, that's just like, I played a little football and basketball. I was never a track runner, but imagine me and Usain Bolt. You guys know who Usain Bolt is? Imagine if we're going to run the 400. I'm starting at the starting line. He's starting at the half point. And I'm supposed to close the gap on him? Really? Seriously. He's got all the training. He's been doing this since he was a kid. All the, resources. Right? He's got all the advantage. I'm just starting from the bottom. How am I to close the gap? I think at best, we should measure African American wealth development not in comparison to anything but ourselves. Right? The goal should be to grow black wealth.
They did not succeed. Africans were not reluctant. Africans did not appreciate this condition. Africans resisted. Africans fought back.
We're in the female dungeons now. First one was the males.
We fought, we resisted, and we prevailed. So that also led. At the end of the day, when you go to the industries, the gold mines, the big gold mines are not owned by Ghanaians. They are still owned by the West. So at the end of the day, if we are making $2 billion from gold revenue, $2 billion is leaving the country. But that is what is difficult for us, because all the time they keep us disintegrated and separated.
The door of no return.
So that's a way of France still ruling the former countries in Africa. So you could imagine the billions of euros France makes from its former colonies in Africa. So now,
for all our ancestors back home.
up to you. It says, in everlasting memory of the anguish of our ancestors, may those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their root. May humanity never again perpetrate such injustice against humanity.
Let's point the choppers in the proper direction, cause you and your eye fight the same oppression. Let's bang together. Cause I ain't your enemy, black man. Look who's doing the mass shootings, mass incarceration. Boys, show ain't the black man. Need to find a common ground with each other and break and play down in the huddle and build up around one another and learn how to move through the struggle as sisters and brothers. Cause trust me, if not, we in trouble. Yeah.